Okay, I want to welcome all of you watching this to our presentation on using composition for teaching about climate change. Um, we have two other groups who have been part of this roundtable, NCT roundtable session on climate change. One is on using literature for teaching about climate change, and one is on interdisciplinary environmental justice on climate change. And all of the presentations for this entire roundtable are on a session website, which you can access. On this session website, um, you can see the different presentations that are listed over on the right. And presenters have uploaded their content to these different sessions. You can also see um, the different videos that are part of these three different presentations. So I welcome you to join that NCTE wiki at Climate Crisis NCT 2020.pbworks.com. So we're now going to share presentations about this topic, and I will be going first, and then the second presentation will be on creating sustaining text with disciplinary literacy inquiries, climate crisis approaches to middle grade English language arts with Alex Ponitz, Jordan Goodson, April Rogers, Catherine Werther. The third presentation, unfortunately, David will not be able to present today. And then our final presentation is on examining the human impact of climate crisis through a multimodal study. So my presentation is on using digital tools to teach about the climate crisis. And I do have a handout which you can access. And the handout includes a lot of links to the different tools I'll be talking about. Um, and so I recommend you go to that particular handout for my resources and links. So when we're talking about sharing through composition, uh, writing, certainly young people are involved with this. They are very much engaged with the need to address climate change because they know their future is affected, certainly as Gerda has talked about. And one really good site for sharing, young people sharing, writing about climate change is the Youth Voices site. Youth Voices is a terrific site where young people, adolescents, are uploading their writing about a lot of different topics. And in this case, they're uploading their writing about climate change and under the category climate action. So you see here, these are different essays writing about climate change on the Youth Voices site. And it's a great place to have your students upload content to this site to share with the world. I think another important aspect of this is thinking about how in comp courses you can communicate about climate change. And Emily Polk, who teaches composition at Stanford University, has talked about the importance of students writing about specific places. And I want to just play a little bit of what she has to say about that topic. This is Emily Polk.
talk about what makes these stories so great. What is it about them that makes them compelling that actually causes or can cause an impact? The first thing we're going to do in this class is look at various types of climate change stories. So we're going to look at climate change in student stories, climate change in social science, climate change in technology, and then students will have an opportunity to develop their own story. So they'll pick a region, a site, or an issue that they feel is not being reported or covered, and they are going to research the issue, research the topic, research the place, which is various stakeholders invested in this place or issue, and they'll put together a feature article for a popular publication, which they will ultimately submit for publication consideration. So it's my hope that you'll come away from this class with a greater understanding of the elements of what makes a persuasive story about one of the most pressing and important issues of our time.
So Emily, in her classes that I've worked with her and some writing, it's really important that she focuses on the local. And I think in portraying the local through the digital, we're engaging students in visual learning. And Gunther Kress talks about this, that the current landscape of communication can be characterized by the metaphor of the move from telling the world to showing the world. New forms of reading, when texts show the world rather than tell the world, have consequences for the relation between makers and remakers of meaning, writers and readers, image makers and viewers. So showing through the visual is what students can do through use of digital tools. And one of those tools involves digital mapping tools. So students can go in, and this is actual project that they engage in. They can identify the emission levels related to traffic and highway buildings and highway heat just by measuring those. And they can then get that data and connect the emissions to different plants in low-income neighborhoods, because this is part of environmental justice as a real key topic. So for example, in my own city of Minneapolis, they could identify where people are getting higher emissions by specific places in terms of pollution, in terms of um, water aspect of water waste and hazardous. So for example, and we have Tampa, Florida, which is home for a number of presenters. They have found, if you look at the mapping of Tampa, Florida, since 1990, a 55% increase in emissions. And that's per person of 4%. Atlanta, similar emissions. So this mapping can be a really useful tool for thinking about shifts in the increased amount of emissions having to do with traffic, more pollution, and so on. And so what these students did is they went in and they looked at Pittsburgh. And one of the interesting things they found was it's not just traffic, it's buildings. A lot of buildings in downtown Pittsburgh were emitting, high levels uh, of heat, and that's can be a real problem. I think one of the problems or challenges when think about the visual is images can be visual spectacles versus the actual experience of climate change effects in terms of heat, flooding, fires, pollution, and drought. So that's a kind of concern that it's not just the visual. We also had to think about in writing to also think about how do we argue our claims about the issues of climate change. Um, Another big problem, I think, is hopelessness and alienation. Like students will then assume, hey, this is just, we can't do anything to deal with this. One of the tools I want to recommend for having students actually respond to images and videos about climate change is VoiceThread. Because one of the things about VoiceThread is you can upload images and video to a VoiceThread site, and then different people, students in a class or people in a, can respond with annotations in response to the same images. So for example, this was a study we did of seventh graders responding to emissions issues where the student portrayed the image of emissions saying, quote, this slide shows a picture trees breathing carbon dioxide and breathing out oxygen. Photosynthesis is the only process that takes carbon dioxide and stores it. So the importance of trees in dealing with climate change. Another student wrote about the tailpipe emissions. This Mustang is releasing combustion. And another student showed the combustions released by factories. So in using VoiceThread, students can use these images to then talk about issues related to climate change. Another really important tool I want to recommend has to do with creating digital stories. And I've involved with a consultant with the Imagine the Future project at the University of Miami, and students at the University of Miami. In part of this project, middle school students have been creating digital stories about climate change. And so they go in and they gather information, they gather images, they gather music, and then they create their little digital stories, which I think are really engaging way of getting students to think about climate change. So here's some examples of some of the ones that they've created. And I want to show one of them, the water one. In this digital story, they talked about the issue of water. And of course, in Miami, water and sea rise is a big problem. So they said, oh, we'll show a bunch of people who created what is called Aquanor for water. The problem with it was it used too much fossil fuel. So here is their little digital story. So they created this Aquanor, and then they thought about issues of water and how, oh, we can create this thing that will create all this new water. However, they found that yeah, this is interesting, we can do this. However, later on, they found that kind of trying to support this was a problem. And you know, they said, oh, we could do it, but we have to use fossil fuel to do it. So this continued to be a problem. So they keep their writing up. Um, and then they said, oh, let's try the Aquanor. Oh, and then look over here. Oh, sorry, the aquifer didn't work, and it resulted in more problems. So that's an example of, you know, the digital story that they created. Another tool I think is important is infographics, and students can create infographics having to do with analysis of different systems influencing climate change. So for example, here's looking at the economic system and the adverse effects of climate change in terms of labor, loss of 155 billion, mortality, 141 billion, and so on. I think another useful set of tools have to do with concept mapping, where students create maps about climate change. And here, for example, the difference between weather on the left and climate on the right, which is a really important distinction for students to understand. And here's another map that was created with the different aspects of climate change. I think another tool is virtual worlds. I want to just show you an example. This is one at Harvard where they created this virtual world where students would go in and study ecosystems in this sort of world.
The EcoXPT project is a project that we started about a year and a half ago that builds on some of our earlier work called EcoMoon. And in order to really understand EcoXPT, you have to understand EcoMoon. EcoMoon is a multi-user virtual environment. Students go into each world and they can explore the world and start to understand the dynamics of the ecosystem. They eventually come across a fish die-off and they're compelled to try to explain it. And they can graph out some of the relationships between population levels going up and down. They can take water quality measurements. They can collect a lot of data to start to figure out what's happening and what's been going on in the world that impacted the fish. So EcoXPT introduces the idea of epistemologically authentic experimentation. What do we mean by that? What we mean is that ecosystem scientists have certain ways of investigating and creating experiments within the large-scale environment that enable them to understand, what changes in certain way, what changes over time, what kind.
So that's a kind of interesting site. So that wraps up my presentation. And so I want to now turn it over to our next presenter, a team from Tampa St. Pete.
Wonderful. Thanks, Rick. I just need the capability to share my screen if that's okay.
So you need to do that. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm sharing. You should be able to put it up.
It says you've disabled.
Oh, okay. Oh, I'm sorry. I need to change that. Sorry.
No worries.
Okay. You should be good now.
And now it says I can't start while you are sharing.
Okay. I'm gonna. Okay. Sorry.
That's okay. We're easy.
Okay.
I think you just have to hit stop share via Zoom.
Right. Yep. Okay.
Awesome. Thank you. So I'm going to hit present, and I just want to make sure that it's still visible. So can everyone see the screen? Okay. So hello, I am Dr. Alex Panos, and I'm here with a wonderful team of folks from the University of South Florida who will each have a chance to introduce themselves and to some of their work. But we're talking about this idea of creating texts, sustaining text from a disciplinary literacy inquiry perspective. And specifically, we've all been working in middle grades context. So we're thinking about this idea of climate crisis in the context of middle grades ELA from a disciplinary literacy perspective. So a little bit about where we're coming from. I am currently an assistant professor at USF and a former middle grades teacher who took a disciplinary literacy stance in my teaching. I also have been researching about teachers and climate change since around 2014. And in this work, I have come to really respect and understand how important it is for teachers in classroom spaces to try out things before they head into their classrooms. When I came to USF last fall, a reading law had just been passed, requiring all teachers, regardless of their content areas or the grades they teach, become competent in some reading standards. And so this course that I taught for the first time last fall, and the folks here with me today, April, Jordan, and Kate, took with me for the first time, is what came out of that to meet those state level requirements. So in my first semester, I taught this course for the first time. The course itself is structured around the idea that we will create inquiry units, write curricula, so teacher as composer of sustaining text here, about a complex interdisciplinary challenge. That challenge was up to students, but these three students chose to focus on the climate crisis. And in so doing, we worked on this idea of multimodal texts, like Rick just talked about, reading and composing those, thinking about critical literacy and the social action imperative that comes from a disciplinary literacy perspective. And this group of students, along with my other students, were placed into substantive focus support groups. So these three women were poised together to work on these topics. And in the class, we composed texts. They composed an interdisciplinary inquiry unit that was comprised of a number of sections. They also did multimodal curriculum reflection, so reflecting on the development of curricular process, and then presented their work digitally to their peers. So that was the big idea of the course and how we came to be together. The literature that all of this is based in, I just want to touch on briefly. It's coming from the idea of disciplinary literacy as a social and cultural access issue, that it's coming from inquiry, and that there are specific needs that ELA teachers have, like the ones that are here with me today. Also coming from a critical literacy perspective that centers this idea of textual critique and reflexivity and social action when we're doing work with text and when we're composing texts. Also localizing the political. I'm so excited about that work you just shared, Rick, with Emily Polk, but thinking about place-based inquiries and the necessity of the specific when you're doing political work like climate crisis work is. And then finally, the idea of composition and curriculum being about eco-curriculum and eco-composition, that we have new needs today in curriculum and we need to be positioning teacher as eco-composer in this work. And that's what these wonderful folks that are here with me today, Jordan, April, and Kate, are going to talk about their lives as teacher, as eco-composer and storyteller, and doing that work personally as pre-service teachers, and then also within their in-service work, because we have a mix of both here. So
Thanks, Alex. Hi, I'm Jordan. I am a graduate student in the Master of Arts in Teaching program at USF, and I'm also a ELA teacher. I taught the middle grades language arts for a couple of years before now, which I'm teaching high school now. But as Alex mentioned, we developed some pretty substantive inquiry units last year in this disciplinary literacy class, and I am really interested and motivated when approaching the subject of the climate crisis on the rhetoric involved in it, as that is something specific to my discipline. And so that is what I focused on in my creation of my inquiry unit. One of the texts that I found to be really compelling was this podcast called The Mothers of Invention. And I thought it would be really powerful for the students to listen to this and then create their own projects. I had in mind for them to create a visual representation of the implications of using language like climate change versus something like the climate crisis or climate chaos. And unfortunately, because in March of last year, we sort of had to go into like emergency teaching mode. So I wasn't able to see this, this project out or the entirety of the unit that I created. But I was able to use what I was learning in the disciplinary literacy course, and I took that to my colleagues, and we were able to kind of come up with we came up with an interdisciplinary approach at that time to try to just make learning meaningful for our students in the midst of the COVID-19 crisis. And we all came up with little projects and assignments to do that all incorporated the issue of climate change. And so this was just an example of my own culminating project that I gave my students at the end of last school year, where they created this environmental advertisement to talk about how people could address specifically Florida's environmental issues. And they used information that they were learning in their other courses as well, like science and social studies.
yeah, thanks, Jordan. So I just want to emphasize that when Jordan shared with us in our collaborative sense making that she was disappointed that she couldn't enact her inquiry unit, but instead what she did was I continually am impressed. She turned during emergency remote teaching to a complex interdisciplinary inquiry unit for students that required coordinating across disciplines, across composing practices, and took her own ideas as an eco-composer of curriculum into her classroom space with her colleagues. It was just really exciting to hear about. And I think she's being modest here with talking about what ended up happening with that. So just thank you, Jordan, for sharing about what you envisioned and how you navigated that in the real world. I think April is up to share next.
Yeah, Thank you, Alex. My goal in this interdisciplinary unit was to engage students with different types of text to reframe their experiences with composition. And one of the challenges of this unit was navigating a political topic. It was in my contract at the private school that I was teaching at the time that I had to avoid issues of conflict and not talk about any areas of controversy within the classroom. So to get around this roadblock, I decided to focus on Florida's waters because it was relevant and the kids, I could use that as an environmental approach. And I used as my mentor text, I chose to use Florida's Changing Waters, which was a recent publication. You can see it right there of 2019. And what I loved about this text is that it was a photographic essay, which was something that I wanted the students to reproduce as well later on in the unit that we didn't really get there. So it worked well. It allowed the students to engage, critically evaluate their own bias that they had towards water, what they thought about the water systems in Florida always being there and never running dry and never having any problems, and really reframed for themselves. They were able to see through the photographs what was really going on with Florida's waters and challenges that we were seeing. I wanted to use social media when I was doing this unit, but that was another challenge that I had because I had to curate for them and take screenshots and share them with them because I wasn't allowed to use social media platforms or allow the students to engage with social media. So I just went around that by, as you can see on the slide, this was one of the ones that I used in my unit, just taking a screenshot from Twitter and sharing that with students. Finally, giving the students the freedom to curate for themselves came in the podcast that they created. It was for the summative assessment for them of the culminating project. We did submit their podcast to NPR, so I got them involved in that, in creating a more global audience for them. And also they were involved with sharing their podcasts with, well, intentionally, they were supposed to be sharing their podcasts with the 6th grade science classes so that they would also get out within their own community and be able to have their voices heard in what they were learning. One of the things that I didn't anticipate happening is that a good portion of my 8th grade students took on an activist orientation by the end of the unit. That wasn't anything that I presented to them, but they got emotional about what was happening and really took on that stance of what was happening to Florida's waters. For example, one of my groups reached out to a Florida state senator for an interview for their podcast. So all of that was pretty amazing. And I was really blown away with what students can do when you give them different types of texts and how they can take them and think critically for themselves, and then what they can produce outside of that, outside of the normal composition essay that is typical of an ELA classroom.
Yeah, thanks, April. I just want to emphasize that watching April compose her curriculum in the schooling context she was in is something that I think a lot of teachers have to navigate, various levels of scrutiny about what is acceptable curriculum. And I just am continually inspired by your turn towards Florida's waters and your turn towards the specific and the local to help you navigate that and what that might mean for other teachers in other contexts. So yeah, thank you, April, for sharing. There we go. Okay, Kate, would you like to share?
Yes, hello. So my name is Kate Worthwine, and I am also a student at USF. I'm working on my master's in secondary English language arts. But today I want to talk to you from the perspective of a student doing writing in the disciplinary literacy course. So when I came into this course, I was really motivated to focus on climate change because of the damage that I'd seen to the town I grew up in from specifically red tide. And so I got really into exploring the stories of climate change and how we can tell the stories of climate change maybe differently. So the unit I designed for this course, it's intended to challenge students to explore the stories of climate change that are happening all around them, and to use narrative writing as a form of advocacy for the ecosystems that they are participating in the Tampa Bay area. And so to do this, I curated a multimodal and diverse text set that explores storytelling and its capacity for advocacy through the written word, the spoken word, visual art, and music. And then, like the text set, I approached my final multimodal reflective essay for this course by also thinking verbally, thinking visually, and thinking aurally, as in sound, not as in spoken word. And all of these things not only made my verbal writing stronger, it also helped me clarify and expand on my thinking. And this final reflective essay, it was definitely a major detour from my, usual academic writing comfort zone. Instead, I tried to embrace both my intellectual reasoning with my affective reasoning, blending both logical thinking with artistic representations. And so I'd like to share a few excerpts from that essay with you all now. So I included a short video examining the relationship between the ecological concept of interdependence and the idea of intertextuality at the start of my essay. And the construction of my video was inspired by Judy Tweet's song, The Sonification of Sea Ice, which I included in my text set for the inquiry unit. And in this song, she translates data on the decline of sea ice into a song using pitch and rhythm. So for my video, I interposed my written words with a video I had taken of the St. Johns River here in Florida in Brevard County. And then I also included timing it to the song River from the band Ibeyi, opening a conversation then between the visual text, the oral text, and the written words. Likewise, I also intertwined photographs and written words throughout my essay, juxtaposing a visual story of an exploration of Florida landscapes with the written story of an exploration of intertextuality. So this was inspired by many texts within the instructional text set that make use of visual storytelling, including one pictured here from Miami-based artist Melanie Oliva's painting, Florida After Image #1. That's that striking red image on the screen. So if you want to switch the slide for me, Alex, thank you. So the end result of my writing was an examination of how student writing is interconnected to the teacher-curated text set and how student-generated text can be positioned as part of our instructional text sets and perhaps even should be positioned as part of the text set. Our students here in Florida and elsewhere throughout the country are experiencing climate change firsthand every day and should be welcomed into the conversation about climate justice through their writing. They have compelling stories to share, and I believe we can amplify their voices by encouraging them to use all the capabilities of their imaginations, to think verbally, to think visually, and to think aurally.
Thank you, Kate. I want to amplify what you constructed here as a beautiful digital multimodal composition, but also want to amplify that your thinking here as a pre-service teacher is a kind of composing that I'm not sure many teachers in the world get time to have access to. And so thank you for this wonderful mentor text of what teacher composing can be when given the time and space to do so, and how important your message is about student text becoming part of the content we teach. And as a teacher myself, that it drives this home from each of you. I've learned so much. One of the things that I wanted to just reflect on after this continued work with these three wonderful women is sustaining what teachers can do, because without teachers composing eco-justice oriented curriculum, it's not possible necessarily for that to happen in classrooms, as April's stories and Jordan's stories attest. It means that we have to take time in teacher preparation and in in-service teacher education on the content of climate change while balancing it with the literacy practices and composing skills that we know students need. Teachers need the space time in their training to consider political context and content of teaching as composing, as each of these wonderful teachers talked about. And that means, for me, encouraging localized inquiries that sustain curricular development around controversial issues, imagining and otherwise for the climate crisis, and collaborative support networks. It's also meant that I've had to become co-learner very explicitly as I learn about my new context in Florida. And together as a collective, we're thinking about cultivating future collaboratives of teachers focusing on the climate crisis. The most recent example that some of us are working on is the book All We Can Save, which came out this year. And they have a set of book circle supports that we're looking to integrate with National Writing Project work here in the state. But thank you so much for this time, Rick.
Thank you, Alex. Okay, our final presenter is Casey. Casey, need to unmute.
Thanks. I'm going to share my screen real quick and then I'll get started. Hi, my name is Casey Short and I'm currently an 8th grade teacher in Charlotte, North Carolina. And I'm going to talk to you guys about how when kids read stories about the climate crisis, they are able to make that human, they're able to understand the human impact. So in 8th grade at my school, the kids do a lot of environmental science in 8th grade science. So they really get a lot of the science part, but I noticed that they weren't really understanding how that science really impacted humans. And then I went to the session actually last year at NCTE, the roundtable session that was done about climate change. And I started thinking like, okay, what can I do in English to really help them understand that? And I figured out that using all different types of stories, starting there, and then helping the kids find their voice and then giving them an opportunity to use their voice in multiple different modalities, whatever worked best for them, was something that worked really well. I just want to say really quick, I have handouts and things posted in a much larger book recommendation list posted on the wiki, and you're welcome to contact me with any questions, or I can send you resources as well, because I certainly don't have time to give you all of the information that I have about this. So the first thing that I want to share is just kind of the big overview about using stories, fictional text, to show students how climate science really connects to human cost of climate change, and really allow them to develop empathy for individuals and communities. And also, as they're reading these things, think about what would climate justice look like in that situation? And how could they advocate for that climate justice? I'm so sorry. I don't know what that did that. So I wanted to take just 2 seconds and talk about a couple of these books. So like I said, I have a much longer book list that I posted, but just a few to highlight. Castaway, I really like it as a book of poems. And I feel like teachers could pull, if they didn't have time for a unit or for kids to choose novels to read, they could pull a few points from that and at least get a little into what they were teaching. Ninth Ward, my students have always really liked, and it is, I taught 6th grade before I taught 8th grade, and it would be more recommended for kids in the lower part of middle grades, but it's set during Hurricane Katrina, and it deals with not only climate justice, but social justice issues, dry, a ton of my students this year have already read that, and they all love it. It is a near future dystopian book, and really shows like what happens if you go to turn the water on and there is no water. You want to take a moment and highlight this book, The Last Bear. It is phenomenal. It is not out yet. It comes out in January, but I had the opportunity to read an advanced copy. I highly recommend you pre-ordering it. It deals with like real issues of climate change, but it is also a really fun story of friendship between a girl and a polar bear. There's a lot of other things that are going on in the story as well, but that specifically is just, I felt like it was the best fictional story that had the facts about climate science, but was also just really fun. So I can't wait for it to come out and to recommend that to all of my students. These are a few questions that could be used for any of the books. So I always advocate for when students are reading a novel, for as much as my curriculum, my school will allow, that they have the opportunity to choose what books they read. So these questions could be used for any of the books that on my more comprehensive book list that have to deal with climate change. So the first questions are really having the kids get into the books to see what the author is actually doing, to see how climate is impacting the story, to see how society is viewing that, what people are doing, what role community plays. And then when you get down to the next two questions, it takes them a step further. So what would climate justice look like? What story? So like in a perfect world, the kids would read their own novel and then read some picture book and short stories and see some videos. So really thinking about what story or what part of your story really impacted them. And then comes to the real work where they start thinking about the intersection of climate justice and social justice, figuring out, is climate justice achievable? What do they think? How does climate change impact humanity today? How do you think it will impact the future? And once you're done reading and you have this new understanding and new compassion, how can you turn that into action? What next? What can you actually go and do about it? So then the next step is having them make a climate justice statement, which is pretty much a thesis statement for their idea. They decide how they're going to use their voice, how they could impact change, what they want to say. If they just had to say one thing, what is their statement? And then once they figured out what it is they want to share, then they start figuring out, so who do I want to share that with? Who could make a difference? Do I want to share it with community leaders? Is it something that the school administration should know? Is it something they want to just tell their parents? Is there a company or a community stakeholder that they want to get in touch with? Do they just want to communicate with, we're a JK-12 school, so do they want to communicate with the lower school kids? Do they want to do something for younger kids? Whatever they want, that's their choice. And the format, they're supposed to consider the audience, obviously, but other than that, the format is totally up to them in the way that they think that their skill set can best be used. Some kids feel very comfortable speaking. They might want to make a podcast or actually go and do a presentation for someone. And other kids are really great artists or writers, or they want to make a slam poem and share it that way. But it's really about making sure that kids not only understand that all the climate science that they learn has an actual human impact, but taking it that step further and realizing, even as a kid, I can make a difference. I can share my ideas. I can call people to action. I can do something about that. And luckily, we're in a time where there's tons of examples that they can look at other kids out in the world who are doing just that. So thank you guys. That is all I have. I tried to make it in the time limit as much as possible. Hold on.
That was so interesting. And I so appreciate the books. Thank you so much, Casey.
You're welcome. There's, like I said, I posted, there's a bunch of other books. I just tried to pick a few, but the polar bear book, I highly recommend pre-order it now. It was like just, especially for lower middle grades, just phenomenal for it to have so much science and it just be so fun. So I love a good book talk.
Any other final thoughts before we wrap up? Okay, I want to thank all the presenters for their excellent presentations. And again, the recording of this video as well as their resources are located on the wiki. They will also be accessed, of course, for the NCTE virtual conference itself. The wiki is Climate Crisis, NCTE 2020.pbworks.com. So thank you all again, and appreciate your time presenting these very engaging ideas for teaching using composition to teach about climate change. So thanks again.
Thank you.
Thank you.